Welcome back to Live from the Heartland. On this Saturday morning, we just heard from the recyclery folks, really good bunch up there on Howard, on Paulina Street, just off Howard. And we're welcoming back for I don't know how many times, Flint, but you are so busy and so involved in the stuff that matters that we can't help it. We have to have you once or twice a year.
No, he's a co-host.
Yeah, that's it. One of the many who don't know that they are.
Irregular host.
So, Flint Taylor is, for those of you who don't know, one of the founders of the People's Law Office, did all of the important, incredibly important work on the the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in Chicago in 1969. That case took 20 years maybe to?
Only 13.
13 years to finally, but these guys worked it and did get some kind of reparations for the families, for the survivors, rather, of that raid. And you're still working in that same field,
Yes, I am.
in that same vineyard. Talk to us about what, first of all, we just got a lot of news about people not wanting to have their kids learn about the torturing of people by John Burge, who is a criminal, and is still making his pension.
So what are you saying? Is John Burke? Go ahead, tell us what that's all about.
Well, if I might, you triggered a lot of, in my mind, sitting here listening, and I just have to say, with regard to Puerto Rico,
Yeah.
that one of our main people that worked in our office for many years, Alberto Rodriguez, he moved to Puerto Rico and happened to be back here when the hurricane hit, and his family was in Puerto Rico. So we had a first-hand report of the trauma that he and his family was going through in a small town in Puerto Rico. And he just is going back tomorrow with a suitcase, 2 suitcases full of stuff for people in his town. And so it is very important to deal with whatever we can do to get materials on the ground,
Yeah.
to try to save those folks from
I mean,
what they're going through.
isn't it only money? We can only send money. If we can't take it to a trunk full of water to
Yeah, it is money and getting it in the hands of
And the right people.
rather
Yeah, those
than the
credit
Red
cards aren't
Cross
working
or
with no
something like
electricity.
that.
Red Cross?
No,
No.
not Red Cross, as we know. That's that's not a good place to give your money.
Huh.
But you need to look at the more, on the ground type of organizations.
yeah.
Well, Flint, do you fill us in on the status of the Burge case? And because one of the things was that there was going to be education in the Chicago public schools about it, and I think that's what Katie was referring to.
Right.
That there's some resistance from some more conservative elements in the community.
Well, if some people may remember that there was a long struggle waged in the streets and to some degree in the courts to try to get reparations, which was a unique concept, of course, in the sense of obtaining reparations. It's been fought ever since the Civil War, of course, by very courageous brothers and sisters in the African American community, but the concept was applied to the torture cases, to the scores and scores of African American men who were tortured by Burge, John Burge, and his men on the South Side. And they didn't have any legal recourse for one reason or another, primarily because the statute of limitations had run and they didn't have any legal case. So what happened was there was a coming together of very strong political forces, Black Lives Matter people, BYP 100, many of the Chicago Torturers Justice Memorials, and lawyers such as ourselves to fight for reparations. And the reparations were not only money for the men who didn't have any legal resource or recourse, but rather also things such as a center on the South Side for counseling, which is now opened up.
That's such a great accomplishment.
And a memorial that's being worked on for the men. I'm not for Robert E. Lee.
Thank you.
And one of the other important facets, which was unique and historic, was to have the torture cases, the torture struggle, the torture reality taught in the Chicago public schools, the 8th and 10th grades. And that had been worked on by people from Chicago Torture Justice and the union, the teachers union, and CPS to figure out what this would look like. And of course, the survivors of torture who are on the street were a big part of that as well. And so it was rolled out or announced just a few weeks ago. It's supposed to start in a month or two, and not surprisingly, I suppose, that the ultra-reactionary, racist Fraternal Order of Police led the charge to say, hey, wait a minute, we want both sides taught. Now you tell me what the other side of a pattern and practice of racist police torture is, and I'll let you teach it. But there is no, it's like there are no two sides here. It's not like they're going to be able to bring in a series of police officers to say, well, it never happened. And so it's just a way to try to block what's rightfully not only a wonderful gain and victory by the forces that fought for this, but an important aspect of teaching people's history. Right. I mean, it's an extension in a way of the concept of Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky and other educators who have taught people's history rather than the man's history. You know, there's that saying that to the victor goes the history. Mm-hmm. And here we're trying to rewrite, in the same way we fought to rewrite the history of the Fred Hampton assassination. And I mean, it took 13 years, and we're still fighting that narrative struggle. Mm-hmm. That it's an assassination, it's a murder, it's not a shootout, that kind of thing. Right. And with the torture struggle, this is a narrative that's going to be established and taught, but we still have to fight to sustain it, because those forces, the ultra-reactionary FOP, the people on the Northwest Side who are being egged on, who are the families of police officers, are holding community meetings and saying, we don't want our kids taught that. We don't want our children knowing about police torture. We don't want our children to know about the tarnishment of the star, so to speak.
So what are you up to now that will deal directly with that, or are you also working on the reparations angle as well?
Well, personally, I'm involved in a case that brings me full circle, and our office full circle. 30 years ago, we got involved in what was the seminal case of police torture in the city, which was the Andrew Wilson torture case. Andrew Wilson was brutally tortured with electric shock. He was suffocated. He had a gun put in his mouth. He was kicked and beaten. And that was because primarily he had been charged with killing 2 white police officers. And it was a tremendously notorious case in the city. There was a manhunt for 5 days that terrorized the entire south and west sides of the community, looking for him and his brother, Jackie Wilson. Well, Andrew Wilson, that's the case that allowed us to uncover the fact that it wasn't just some crazed one-time torture, but that in fact it was a pattern and practice of over 100, 125 more than that African-American men tortured by this group of police officers, detectives, sergeants, and of course the leader, John Burge. Well, Andrew Wilson had a brother named Jackie Wilson, and he happened to be driving the car when the 2 officers were killed. He was convicted, he was tortured, he got a life sentence. He's been in jail now for over 35 years. He had just been granted a new hearing, so the case that I came in on that allowed us to expose over decades the pattern and practice of police torture has now come around again in court, and we're planning for a hearing in front of Judge Hooks out at 26th Street to try to get Jackie Wilson out on the basis that his confession was tortured. So now we are looking at 30 years of evidence that we and others have developed to put into his case to say he deserves a new hearing, his confession should be thrown out of court, and he should finally be freed after all these years.
We elected a new state's attorney a year or so ago, Kim Fox, and that was seen as a way into some of these abuses, or to address some of these abuses, particularly the race-based inequities and historic inequities in the state's attorney's office. I remember back when Julie Hamas was working for Richie Daley and in the state's attorney's office, and everyone was called a Willie. I was informed. Every defendant was a Willie. So the dehumanization and the right-wing stuff, I forgot where I started.
Talking about state's attorney.
Thanks.
How's she doing?
Yeah, how's she doing? Thanks.
Well, in legal terms, the jury's still out. It's a massive task. You mentioned Richie Daley. Richie Daley, of course, was state's attorney for 8 or 9 years, followed by Devine, and followed by Alvarez. And during that entire period of time, looking specifically about police torture, they were not only aware of it, but they were actively covering it up. And Daley particularly was, we later uncovered evidence that Daley was right there, knew about that Andrew Wilson case, knew he should have prosecuted Burge at that time and stopped all of this torture, but instead, of course, covered it up and did nothing. Well, that legacy of many, many years, Kim Fox has to deal with. It's a code of silence that works in the state's attorney's office the same way it works in the police department, and goes all the way through to the prison system. It's a very pernicious, racist system, and we wish her luck, and we certainly hope that she'll persevere, but she has a hell of a task to try to change that.
Flint Taylor, I remember when the Chicago Police Department was overwhelmingly white and men. Things have certainly changed since then. There are many women on the police force. There are many people of other races and backgrounds on the police force. Yet we have the Fraternal Order of the Police running the show. There used to be the African American Patrolmen's Association, and the woman leader of that, Pat Hill just passed away.
Right.
I think Renault Robinson is still around.
Yeah.
We see a couple of black police officers took a knee, and we're getting reprimanded for that. I wondered, what is the status of the police department? I mean, you must have people on the department who are friendly to your work. We certainly used to have friendly kind of left-wing cops stopping by the Heartland.
I don't know if you'd call them left-wing.
Well, they were sort of,
They were
bought the
just
books.
friendly.
Yeah, no, but I knew a few more than you, those guys. And I'm just wondering if you could give us an overall view about non-whites in the department, other organizations in the department, where you see that all going.
Well, you're right that there's been changes in the demographics, as it were, of the department, but the culture hasn't really changed. The culture that we're talking about, and the idea that you're not black, you're not white, you're not a woman, you're not a man, but we're blue. Mm-hmm. And that's that code of silence. And people like to say, well, it's a few bad apples, that Burge is a bad apple. But in fact, it's a system. There couldn't be, unfortunately, Burges. There couldn't be the 10% or the 5% that rack up the predominant amount of the complaints of brutality and racism if the other 85% didn't look the other way, if they didn't come in when there were disciplinary processes and look the other way and say, I didn't see that, or it didn't happen. So that
How
whole
do you get
system,
to that?
well, it's your job. I mean, some of us who go way back may remember the name of Frank Laverty. Frank Laverty was the Serpico, the man who broke the code of silence in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And he came forward in a case of ours and exposed the fact that the police were keeping for decades street files. They had files where they kept the evidence that showed that a defendant might be innocent secretly away from the prosecutors and the police. And he exposed that, and as a result of that, a young man we were representing who was perhaps headed for death row was exonerated because the files showed that, in fact, there was another guy who committed the crime. That was in the secret street files. What Laverty, not the cops who did this, were promoted, nothing happened to them. But Laverty was busted from being a detective down to watching recruits give urine samples at 11th and State, the headquarters. So that's the message. And not only that, he was physically threatened. So that was what happened then, and no doubt what still happens to cops who come forward. So that's why you have that silent 85%, because you might be going out to arrest someone and your partner's behind you, and he might not cover you if maybe you, quote, ratted on them when they committed some act of brutality.
Speaking of brutality, what about last year or recently in the news, we had a lot of news about Holman Square, where apparently the police were taking people and interrogating them, holding them, etc. What's the current status of the Holman Square situation?
Well, that's another case we're involved in, and I've just been in court recently on it. We're fighting very hard with the police department to get the evidence about the parameters of Holman Square. Holman Square, as you said, is a place where they were secretly taking people off the books, working them to try to turn them into informants, trying to get information on drugs, on guns, on gangs, and at times there was torture and brutality going on in those secret walls. It got exposed by the Guardian newspaper a year or two ago. We filed a lawsuit on behalf of several men who were held there and ultimately were charged and spent 15 months in jail. And now we're fighting over Rahm's emails. We want to see what Rahm knew about this place. We're fighting over we just got information there were 254,000 emails that had the name Holman Square in it. We're trying to figure out now how to deal with all of that.
Who's going to read them all?
I don't know. But yes, that's a problem. But it also tells you perhaps maybe there was something going on there beyond what Rahm and the city has conceded. So as far as I know, they're still using the place, and it's still something that people need to be outraged about.
Flint, we're going to run out of time, but why don't you take this opportunity to share any thoughts that you have on cases or whatever, and tell people where they can read your writing, because you have started to write for notable progressive journals about the good work that you and the People's Law Office are doing.
Well, thank you. One thing that's been on my mind, and I'm just putting together a piece on, and perhaps maybe doing some consulting work in, is the Charlottesville case, or what happened in Charlottesville. And what happened in Charlottesville, people know. That a grouping of Unite the Right organizations came together, and the rest is unfortunately history in terms of the violence that happened and the fact that the police turned the other way, that they either intentionally or neglectfully were unable to handle this situation. We don't know yet what the FBI knew, but we can assume that they were monitoring all these organizations. And the first thing that came to my mind, Michael and Katie, was Greensboro, 1979.
Amen.
I spent 6 months in 1985 trying the Greensboro case with some other wonderful lawyers. It was the same scenario, almost 40 years ago. It happened. Unite the Right with the Nazis and the Klan got together, and they decided they were going to attack anti-Klan demonstrators, and they killed 5 of them. And when we did that case, we saw that went back to the 50s and the 60s, to the FBI turning the other way when the Klan would beat up and kill civil rights demonstrators and protesters. So there's a line of history that we need to understand here to understand Charlottesville going forward.
Thank you, Flint Taylor. Thank you, Jesse. And from Recyclery. And thank you all for listening. Thanks, Morgan Lonergan, Reed Himes, all our missing compatriots.
Nolan Chin downtown.
Bless your heart. Do the good in the world needs all the good you do.
All power to the people. Take us out with some music.
Right on. Thank you all for being here.